Hi, everybody. Welcome to It's Going to Be All Right. I'm Clayton Gwen.
And I am Niklas Mitrovic.
And we are hot on a topic that, Niklas, you and I, we've been working on this for a couple of weeks now, trying to design some resources to help our students at the NMBU, Norwegian University of Life Sciences, particularly because they are going to mostly be doing home essay exams, and we want to make sure that they're not stealing ideas from people.
Exactly. So we've been working on this. It's almost like a information video. Is that what you call it?
Yeah, I guess so. An infomercial in a way.
Yeah.
Except we're not selling anything really. We're
No, just selling
sharing open access resources.
Exactly, and we're kind of selling the idea of that plagiarism is something that you should take extremely seriously.
Yes,
but
it's the equivalent of go to jail card in Monopoly if you are at a university.
Yeah. Or, I mean, realistically, I think if you get busted for plagiarism, isn't like 1 or 2 semester you're gonna get suspended? Isn't that the punishment?
Ooh, yeah. I mean, it depends on the degree of plagiarism. So it could be that you fail the assignment at the most lenient degree. It could be that you fail the course and we'll have to take it again. And on the more extreme end, it could result in expulsion.
Exactly. And
Now,
I think that in most cases, people end up kind of plagiarizing without necessarily, that's not the intention, right? So they end up failing the exam or like something like that. Because some of the citations or references are wrong or they're not there, you know?
Mm-hmm. And plagiarism can happen for a number of different reasons, of course, which we can end up getting into. But any university worth their salt, as well as any academic peer-reviewed journal, will give very clear and very strict guidelines on what plagiarism is, what the consequences of plagiarism can be. And again, the severity of it really kind of depends on where you are in your academic career. So as a first-year bachelor student, plagiarism might be taken to be seen as a lesser offense, say for, just a intro course assignment. Because you're kind of a junior academic, this is new to you. But of course, I mean, if you're said to have plagiarized something as a professional researcher, that is career done for many people. That is the loss of credibility. That means, nobody is going to want to publish your work. All of the work that you have done leading up to that point will very likely be called into question. And it may come with really, really severe consequences for not just your reputation, but your career as an academic or a researcher.
But it seems like there are some cultural differences here as well, because I think I was talking to some of the veterinary PhD students at Adamstuen in Oslo, and I was giving this like a talk, like a small lecture about plagiarism, and I think there was a Pakistani student who told me that if you get busted for plagiarism in Pakistan, you might go to jail. I'm not really. I think that's what she told me. I'm not really sure, but
interesting.
That sounded.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before, because some academic and professional cultures, be it publishing or research, really treat plagiarism like theft, like stealing. But maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. For those listeners who only have a loose understanding of what plagiarism is, perhaps we could give a bit of a better definition to it.
I think that's a good starting point. And plagiarism in its essence is using other people's work. So it could be a part of it or it could be the whole thing, but it is using it without including citations and sources in their literature lists. And the thing is that if you don't present or if you don't give the reader a source, then you will, in a way, portray the information as it is your own creation.
And this can be quite difficult sometimes for a number of reasons that we're going to get into, but not only is plagiarizing to be considered using part or a complete whole of somebody else's work, and that comes in many different forms. It could be an idea, it could be a quote, it could be data, it could be figures, tables, pictures, any sort of thing, really.
Or like text published on the internet. I mean, anything.
Exactly.
And you
but
said
you
an
can,
idea. That is a relatively vague thing, but it happens that people get. I mean, people are even getting sued for stealing ideas that have only been talked about during a meeting or a brainstorm session or something like that.
So it's a crazy world that we have to navigate, but it's actually also possible to plagiarize yourself.
Yes.
Self-plagiarism
it is.
as well. That if you are a student or you are a researcher and you are using previous works that you have contributed or submitted elsewhere, be it for a course assignment or if you're a professional researcher, to other journals, other text sources, maybe like a newspaper or an op-ed piece or something like that. And if you reuse many, more particularly if you're really reusing a large part of that without citing yourself, you are really committing plagiarism.
But the interesting thing about self-plagiarism is that, I mean, if you were a professional researcher, just like you're a PhD student, right? So if you want to use something from an article that you published, let's say 6 months ago, you could just put in a reference to yourself.
Yeah.
But a student can't really do that because a lot of the stuff that they write isn't really published. I mean, it's previous exams and term papers and stuff like that. So then the only way around it is, I mean, let's say that you've written a term paper and then it's time to do the exam and you want to write about the same thing, or you get like a, what do you call it? Oppgave?
An assignment.
An assignment that asks for something that you have by coincidence been writing about before. Then the only way around it, as far as I know, is to find different sources and just kind of what do you call it? Remake the ideas,
Rephrase, recompose, rephrase, redesign,
rebuild.
Definitely support with new sources. And you're right. There is a very big difference between the complexity and the nuance of self-plagiarizing when you are a professional researcher, where it is easy. Oh, I do have things, that have been published, or I have things going through publication right now, so I can even cite it as something that is forthcoming. Students, bachelor and master students, don't have that same opportunity. And very often you go through a program, especially if you have a program with a lot of writing, like in the social sciences and the humanities, even lab reporting in the natural sciences. There's a very fine line there, but I mean, quite often in that case, if you're a student, self-plagiarism, at least I would argue, or the way I would see it, is when you're actually copying whole parts of previous work, and it's less concerned with the idea that
like
you
the good
are
old
dealing with.
copy-paste.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the easiest way to kind of not risk any self-plagiarism is to, I mean, if you have to write about something that you've written about before, like the same ideas, the same, let's say it could be the same theoretical framework that you're going to use to analyze something. You can find different sources, and you just have to change the wording a little bit or a lot, depending on how much text you're going to use. And then you also place that, ideally, you could place that information in a new context, and that will naturally change a lot of the text. And what you could also do is, I mean, just using different sources, as I said, that will really get rid of the problem.
Even putting the same idea into a new context could be one way to do it. So if you're a student, a bachelor or a master's student listening to this, realistically, what self-plagiarism is for you and what you should be concerned about is it's basically cheating. It's the university's way of saying we are not going to give you credit for work that you have already submitted for previous credits. So in that way, self-plagiarism would be the same as any other form of plagiarism where you are using other people's work as a way of reducing the amount of work that you need to do. Basically, it is just kind of the copy-paste. And it's important that we're aware of this because there's a reason why you have to submit digital copies of assignments at universities. And that's not to make things easier. It's not to save paper, even though it does both of those. It's because your work is going through software to detect plagiarism. And that means once you are in and there's a file on you as part of your academic career, it's easy for professors to not only check your current assignment that you've submitted against the vast stores of information that are out there on the internet, but that it's also going to be detecting this against things that you have already submitted and have been put onto your file as part of your academic accomplishments.
I mean, an interesting thing about this plagiarism detecting softwares, because there's a bunch of them, is that I get questions about this all the time from students, all the way from bachelor to PhD. And it seems like people think that it's some kind of like a mystical machine that is situated somewhere in the basement of the university.
Have you seen the University of Bergen's plagiarism video where it is a giant robot that they store on campus?
Is it? Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
no, I'll link that into the show description.
Seen that one.
That
made this even more funny.
It's quite comedic, and they do a good job of pointing you to sources of information on proper citation and referencing so you can avoid plagiarism. But it's quite funny, actually.
But the crazy part is that a lot of people are super... When I tell them about this software, they're like, oh, I can see them almost, that they freeze to ice. And then they're afraid that everything they're writing is plagiarism. Someone has been writing this before. I need to, look through every published piece of writing throughout history. But the thing is that NMBU uses something, I think it's called Urkund. It's a German word, so I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Urkund or something like that. But that's the software that NMBU uses. The students, they can access it because it's only for the staff and not everybody. I mean, I don't have access to the program.
Yeah,
a lot of people ask me that all the time, if they can send stuff to the writing center and I will do a plagiarism check, which I can't.
And I don't want to do it. Why would we want to help somebody cheat? I mean, I'm sure most people are expecting, well, you could help me to avoid cheating. But
some people don't want to go to jail, That's as I told you. Some of them are super nervous, so they're like, "Oh, please, can't you just get this software, like the best one, and I can send you my thesis or article or something." But you know what? To be honest, if I even had the software, I wouldn't offer anything like that because it would take all my time just to run people's work through this software. So it's way too time consuming. And I think people should just learn to cite and to cite correctly. And then then it shouldn't be a problem.
Exactly. And it's not difficult to learn. I still go in and lecture on citations, plagiarism, referencing styles as part of lectures or workshops. And I tell people, when I first went to university now well over a decade ago in Canada, within the first weeks of being there, we were immediately marched down to the library where we sat and had a referencing and citation course with the librarians. And the librarians were the central hub for all of this. They had information and kind of, you could call them air quote, cheat sheets. The internet was becoming a much more powerful tool at that time. So these were becoming available as PDF files, easy to access and use all the time. So I don't think we need to go in and discuss the ins and outs of how you should properly cite or reference, because any university library will provide information on that service. And on top of that, you don't have to do it like I did, where you had to learn a style and you had to manually complete your citations and reference lists, which is still something I do just out of habit, basically.
Yeah, I do the same thing, but that's because you and me, we're like in the middle of our 30s.
We're dinosaurs.
So, yeah, so we're not like 22 years old. Now you got...
Old habits die hard.
Exactly. Now there are like EndNote and stuff like that, which just does it automatically for you. But I remember when I was in university, I learned, I think it was like a couple of lectures on Harvard style and Chicago. It was Harvard and Chicago. That was the two styles that we learned. And I remember that like Harvard just made more sense to me. So that's the one that I ended up using. And I used that throughout my years at University of Oslo. And then I switched to APA a couple of years ago. But it's it's more or less the same thing.
Yeah, subtle differences in the format, but they all serve the same purpose. You're lucky, though, that you only had to do two, because in the department I studied at in Canada, I had to learn, I think it was 3, and maybe for one course I had to learn another style. So it was
really?
the Harvard style, the Chicago style, which was at the time quite popular for, and I think still is for, a lot of law and history. So if you ever read like Noam Chomsky, for example, he's using the Chicago style, endnotes or footnotes.
Footnotes and stuff like that, yeah. I never used footnotes. I was just kind of like intimidated by it for some reason, because it just seemed more complex. So I was, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going for the Harvard style.
I've more or less tried to seize that. I like the endnotes, but then I found footnotes were a good way to kind of fill in what could be, tangential information. So
it's like a digression.
Yeah,
but it
exactly.
Be
it's just telling other stories in the margins of your writing.
Yeah, I think I would appreciate it now, because I'm as we said, I'm getting older and I'm slowly getting more and more crazy or set in my ways, and I find my own thoughts so incredibly amusing that maybe footnotes is something for me now.
It's a possibility.
Could
so
be.
I know we said we weren't going to really dive into the nuts and bolts of it, but there are some, I do have to say, there are some benefits to certain styles, because one thing that actually does bother me about citing in an APA or an MLA or a Harvard is it really breaks the writing apart. Using something more like the Chicago style and then having a footnote, you can immediately find that information without kind of getting lost in the pages.
That's a good point.
Like, different strokes for different folks. Realistically, if you're a listener, if you've made it this far to our rant on and tangent on all of this, realistically, all you need to know is software will do a lot of this work for you. The programs are easy to use, and they're quite widely available and accessible. And citations and referencing perform the same function regardless of the style that you use, to direct the reader to where you're originally getting this information from.
Because that's the point. And all these different styles, they have the exact same purpose, and that is to direct the reader to where the information is from, just to kind of say exactly what you said. That's the purpose. And I wouldn't say that there's probably a lot of bad styles out there, but the most famous ones are all pretty good.
Yeah.
I'd say. I don't really think too much about it when I read something. And the styles may vary, but I don't really notice it. Not necessarily. I'm just kind of...
No. Once you get used to the purpose of them, you understand their function, you understand how they're presenting information to you, and it's almost more of like a dialect. You just have to get used to it. You understand more or less what everything is. It may be things are just in a slightly different order or format. But, I kind of want to circle...
Again, the library can really assist all of the listeners, whoever you are, with questions about citations and references, and provide guides, and there are, as we said, softwares that will do this for you. The only thing you need to do is like pay attention to if there's any problems with the program, so it kind of creates references that for some reason are wrong. But that's the only thing that you need to pay attention to, I think.
So I just wanted to circle back now that we've kind of gone way off into the bushes about citations and referencing styles. A footnote, if you will.
It was a footnote.
It was.
We're using Chicago style for this podcast.
I'll put that footnote in the show notes, a footnote about where the tangents occur. I wanted to circle back to kind of where we had started with this, is that there's a lot of plagiarism that happens because it's unintentional. You know, in reality, the experiences that I have had working with students who have come into the writing center, or cases of plagiarism that I have heard that have been presented across the university, it's very, very difficult to prove an intention that someone was willingly trying to cheat because they were being lazy, or that they were trying to steal somebody else's work. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. Intentional plagiarism definitely does happen. For those reasons of people trying to actually steal things or to cheat. But predominantly it is, as you had said earlier, it's more of a culture of how we treat ideas in academia, and not just the severity of how we treat plagiarism, but generally, you know, what is something that needs to be cited and why do we need to cite it? And in a bit of my preliminary research for this episode, I was pulling up just some different thoughts and articles on what plagiarism is and, you know, a bit of the history to it. And realistically, like, plagiarism is almost inextricably intertwined with the concept of intellectual property rights. And these are very Western ideas. These are things that kind of emerged from Greek philosophy.
Yeah, so, and go all the way through Roman culture, and then
to the point that we still know what Aristotle said, what Socrates said, because people found it important to credit those sayings and those teachings to those particular people. We have quotes of Julius Caesar as well, which, I mean, they may have changed or been a little bit altered in translation, but still, even things like that are such a part of kind of Western culture in how we think and how we view the world.
I mean, a lot of cultures hasn't really been having there's been thousands and thousands of years of relatively, highly civilized society without really having a written language. And that will also kind of make the whole plagiarism thing much more difficult and kind of vague. I mean, if you think about it, this is something that we've been talking about, I don't know, I think it was last week, that chances are that people came up with a lot of the same ideas as, let's say, one of the classic Greek philosophers, but they just never wrote it down. So, I mean, lost in time, I guess.
Yeah. Or the records were destroyed when the libraries were burned.
Yeah,
those things
that could also happen. That also happened.
Yeah, but in the more modern epoch, realistically, what we can end up seeing is that your understanding of plagiarism, your understanding of how to properly cite and reference information, is intertwined with the education and the cultural system that you come from. And this has been something I've definitely noticed is quite problematic for certain international students coming from areas where there is a very different cultural approach and cultural milieu to how you treat education and learning and information and ideas, where in some cultures copying is to be expected because it demonstrates your ability to pay precise attention to things. It kind of documents your ability to understand what the educator, the professor, who is still, kind of up on a pedestal and professing to the audience. So some of these cases of unintentional plagiarism that I've seen at the university, I think are more likely stemming from contexts like that, where people, it's unintentional, they don't know, and on top of that, they haven't really been taught this different view that someone else's idea has an inherent worth or value, and you always need to demonstrate to give credit to the person who came up with that idea. So not only are we dealing with very specific sort of like formatting issues of showing a reader where they can find information that you're using to support an argument or a stance or an example that you're providing in your writing, but we're also dealing with a deep-seated cultural worldview. I don't think that universities yet in the Western world, or at least maybe here in Norway, have really grasped that idea and found really effective ways to encourage people to avoid this unintentional plagiarism. Now, of course, I can't speak for everyone because in Canada, I ended up going off to, a very intensive course to learn how to do this right out of high school, my first week of university. So just saying it's going to be different at every university you go to.
I think that, as you said, there are some cultural differences, but one of them is also that educational system can be quite different. So I just had this, I talked to this Italian student, and he was, to this person, writing a term paper was something completely new. I mean, they only have in-school exams for like 3 to 5 hours, and that's it. Mm-hmm. So the whole approach is very different. And a lot of these students, they don't really write anything on their own until they are at PhD level. Or they have to like write their master thesis. So, and that is also something that creates problems, because then you will have to go through this whole process, which I remember that I did, that you first have to learn how to properly cite and reference, and then you kind of get this feeling that, well, but the original author wrote this so much better than me and that I can ever do. So I just use the exact same thing. And then you'll end up in this kind of environment where you're just kind of dumping information.
And I guess there's 3 things that you've brought up there. There's one, the sort of culture where education is sort of spoon-feeding, or students are expected to just be sponges and soak up ideas and information for 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 years, depending on the program.
It's like an old view on education and how it works. That you just fill people's head with knowledge.
Exactly. And then in the final year or the final semester of these 3 to 5 years, they're suddenly expected to do things completely differently and perform an excellent job of it with no mistakes, with no plagiarism. So, of course, some of this falls into the things that you and I work with of trying to find ways to integrate writing into programs that traditionally don't have a large amount of writing, so that students can get the benefit of practice along the way, because developing a skill and understanding in how to avoid plagiarism can be quite important for the completion of a master's or, say, a PhD. The second thing would be, well, if someone else has said it better than you ever could, I think that kind of comes to the idea of, is there really anything new in the world? Are there new ideas? And the third point you brought up about information dumping, which I think kind of links to all of these, that, okay, you become informed that there is this thing called plagiarism and you should avoid it. You compound that with this feeling of, I don't think I'm really an expert in what it is I am writing about, so I'm just going to dump a bunch of other people's information together, and voila, there is my academic creation, which typically ends up just being a literature review without any deeper analysis. It's almost more of like an examination of the current thoughts on something today, my thoughts excluded.
And another interesting thing that is usually happens here is that so they're not trained to write anything on their own. And then they kind of learn about plagiarism, about citations, about references, and then they end up doing an information dump. But the problem is that they have never learned to be creative in this process, and that's that's key if you're going to write something which is using, let's say, a famous theory or something, and then analyzing something. That's using a system, like a way of thinking, and applying it to something, and that's where the creative aspects come in. Like the way you apply these thoughts, that's your own creation. But that's also something that needs to be, I mean, you're not going to be good at that if you don't do it a lot.
Yeah.
It requires practice.
And I think a lot of this connects to an earlier episode where we were talking about the importance of receiving feedback, not just in writing, but generally through these other sorts of skills, the creative skills, the analytical, the evaluative skills that we really sort of value in scientific disciplines. I mean, even within something like the humanities and history, there should be a lot of creativity there in a way, finding these stories that haven't been told before, telling the same story from a different perspective so that we can have maybe a more holistic understanding of our past. So maybe one thing that we should also do is sort of, for those listeners who are unfamiliar with the term information dump, we could give a brief description of that. How would you describe an information dump?
Okay, so first of all, I've seen a lot of different term papers and stuff that students have been writing or been working on as a writing advisor, but also as an employee in Østfold University College and NMBU. So usually it's only like a section that is an information dump, and that basically means that it's like one sentence and a reference, one sentence and a new reference, one sentence and a new reference, and it's only facts. And it's usually to build some kind of a foundation to what you're going to do next. So many times you will see that kind of the section before the discussion part could be an information dump just to get all the facts on the table, and then that will be discussed later. So it's not really contextualized, because if they would contextualize all these facts, then you would kind of start analyzing at this point, and that will make up for much better writing. But a lot of times people just kind of want to get all the facts on the table, and that's when many people end up just dumping information.
And one of the hard things I think about information dumping is I very often see it in introductions. You're trying to develop the context for what it is. So, here is a problem as cited by, these 5 different research teams. Here is a more specified part of that problem with 3 more research teams. On top of that, there are also all of these people who are talking about it. And in a way, it is this idea that you are wanting to, of course, show what has been done and develop a background. And that's good, and you should do that, and you should cite that material. But it is, like you say, it's done in such a way where it's just stating facts, and it is devoid of a connection to what it is you're writing about, what it is you're researching, and why this background data or these background facts about what other people have done or what other people have found is actually relevant for the problem, the puzzle, or the gap that you're actually researching. And I've seen papers that are almost entirely information dumps where almost every sentence is just a citation all the way through, which you're not plagiarizing, but you're still just copying other people's work and dumping it in, usually under the assumption that having properly cited and referenced these things, all of this data and these facts are just going to magically create a good story and a compelling research article, which is rarely the case. I
mean, I must admit, I've also seen what is supposed to be a discussion part in the text, and it's an information dump, because what they do is that they find results from different research and they just kind of piece them together. I remember I think it wasn't a term paper, but it was a home exam that I was evaluating, and the whole thing was just like it was just quotes that been stitched together. And I'm saying quotes. It wasn't like it hasn't been paraphrased or anything. It was quotes that been carefully placed together to form a new text.
Yeah, I have seen that as well.
The entire thing, like I think it was a 6-page home exam. I mean, imagine doing something like that. it's pretty obvious that the person had been reading the curriculum, but
Yes.
there was no original ideas. There was no evaluating if something was accurate or not, because this was in pedagogy, and the person was supposed to apply a lot of pedagogical theory to what they've been doing. Like they've been, what do you call it? Like a practice teacher.
Yeah, doing their practicum.
Exactly, doing their practicum, and they were supposed to analyze what happened using these different theories. But the thing was that there was nothing from that, nothing from the real world. It was only quotes stitched together to form some kind of a new narrative.
Now, as impressive as that is to have gone through and directly quoted multiple authors and properly cited and referenced them across 6 pages, I mean, that's quite
Because it
a
is
feat.
pretty hard.
Yeah.
It is pretty
Yeah.
hard. It's
But-
harder than to write anything on your own.
But a major problem with doing something like that is, you're absolutely right. No original thought, no analysis, no evaluation. In a way, I almost see
in what you're saying.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you
Yeah,
think?
exactly.
What was your
And-
experiences? What's your thoughts?
And I think what ends up happening in these sorts of circumstances where you have this like excessive amount of information dumping, it's because people have learned about what plagiarism is and the ramifications of it. And all that they really know how to do is read and sort of copy out the information that they think the professor or the course responsible or the examiner wants to hear. And so I think we come to something that we've touched on in some other episodes, that maybe the underlying issue here isn't just necessarily this sort of like unintentional plagiarism and not educating people towards it, or educating people about plagiarism and then we get information dumping instead. I think the root of some of this is we're not necessarily, like you say, stimulating academic cultures of creativity, of original thought, of looking for trends. And I've seen this in courses that I have taken as a bachelor and master's student, where you're told, do not read outside of this course, just cite from the one textbook. Okay, so like what new original ideas are supposed to come in? And to the
What
point
a
where,
lazy course responsible that must have been.
yeah, like
They just don't
how
wanna
are we?
get-
And I mean, this comes down to the design of courses as well. What is the real intention and the learning objective? Is it just to learn the theories and learn the concepts? Or is it to have students learn these theories and these concepts, but find ways to apply them, to create
think-
deeper analysis and deeper evaluation?
It sounds like the course responsible was very much afraid of being exposed. Like, oh, I don't know this. I haven't been reading about this. I mean, I think there's lots of factors that play in at the same time. And one of them is definitely that a lot of people get told by their professor that we're not interested in your original thought at all because you're not a professional researcher yet.
Yeah.
Then you can start. I mean, in my opinion, that is the completely opposite way of what I'm thinking. I mean, if you want to create people who can think for themselves, that's something that you need to nurture. You need to build them. You need to help them achieve that. It doesn't happen by itself for many people.
Exactly. And this is something, it's a skill, critical thinking, analysis. These are mental, cognitive processes and skills that develop over time and with practice, just like becoming a good communicator or a good writer. And so when is the appropriate time, I guess, to develop this? Because I see these same problems happening across PhD students as well, where it's a lot of information dumping. They're not even necessarily sure what it is that what they found, or why what they found is important, or why the project that they're doing is important. So where in the academic process are we supposed to create researchers and academics if we don't encourage people to develop forms of analysis at early levels? And then there's suddenly this expectation that, you should just know how to do it if you're taking a PhD, which I think
it doesn't
is...
happen by itself.
No,
for
it's
some
putting...
people, for some people it does. I mean, we talked about this many times before, but I enjoy playing guitar, I enjoy drawing, I enjoy a lot of creative activities. So to me, just I know that you like the writing part and maybe not the pre-writing part that much, but I really enjoy the pre-writing. And it's because that's when the brainstorming, to me that's it can be difficult, but it's very much a creative process where you try to find synergy between different concepts that you want to use to analyze something, and to me that is very interesting. It's hard work, but it's
It is, yeah.
but it's creative.
It
So
is,
that's what
and-
I enjoy, because you kind of create your own language of how to decipher something, and that's a fascinating process to me.
And I know for all the conversations that we've had about it, it's not that I don't like the pre-writing stage. I just recognize that's where a lot of the hard work, for me anyways, is going to be. So it's more of because I'm trying to be creative in that process to really figure out what is it that I'm working on and what are the concepts and the theories and the evidence and the real world examples that help to form that idea. I struggle with that a lot because, well, very often you have to be analyzing what you were reading to determine what is and is not relevant and what has and has not been done before. And to give an example of my own real world research, I am finding the more and more I dig into the pre-writing, there are a lot of people who have been trying to work around a very similar aspect that I'm doing, and their approaches are not radically different, but I'm always able to sort of be a bit more creative and think, okay, well, so what was the background of this person and why would they have put it into this perspective? And what is it about that approach that is good but is maybe incomplete with a new or a different way of thinking? And finding...
I think what you're saying now is super important, because it's a lot of people kind of end up they almost hope that they're going to reinvent the wheel, right? And that's having too high expectations of yourself, in my opinion. You need to understand that you will create something that is new, but it might not be radically different from something else. But I mean, to create something that is radically different and will change the zeitgeist or something is very rare.
Yeah. I'm still waiting for that to happen, and I don't hold out high hopes. But maybe just being a bit more of a realist about it, it still makes the research fun. It makes it enjoyable. And of course, we've talked about this before. If people are interested in some of these like pre-writing processes, we have a episode on that. A lot of this is all intertwined, that not only is this analysis, the interpretation, so that's what analysis really is. You could, and this I'll read direct from my show notes verbatim so you could see how prepared I was. Analysis is an interpretive process that draws conclusions from a set of data or facts, or it could also be breaking something complex apart to examine its components and develop a better understanding of it. So either approach of that analysis that you take, there is a very creative element in there because you have to interpret it yourself. And part of my process of why I struggle with this so much is because not only am I trying to avoid plagiarism by reading and citing a lot of information and developing a reference list as I read, and then I'm also trying to, in order to avoid information dumping, I'm really trying to link these ideas to my own specific interpretation and my understanding of these ideas and how they fit, particularly across multiple, in this case, I have probably read hundreds of technical documents, peer-reviewed journals, government reports. I'm up to my ears in this stuff. And it's coming together more and more and more that I feel that the analysis has led to an evaluation. I can create something new. I can avoid both plagiarizing and information dumping because I have at least a slightly different original idea. Not maybe wholly new, but it's different enough to find the weaknesses of something and suggest potential ways that we could strengthen an approach, for example.
I think that, both of us like to use a lot of analogies when we explain something, and when it comes to deconstructing something, to use different theoretical concepts to deconstruct some kind of a social phenomenon, for example, The thing is that it's comparable to deconstructing a car or a plane or something, but not really at the same time, because when you're deconstructing a car, you will pick it apart and you will find all the different things that it consists of, like yeah, I don't know a name of any part inside of a car, but like
A doorknob,
call it?
a steering wheel,
exactly. Like
catalytic converters.
You pick it apart, the motor, the pipes, the all the different things. But when you pick apart a social phenomenon, you have to define these parts yourself. Like they're not defined on beforehand in many cases. So it's like picking something apart and kind of inventing what it is at the same time.
Yeah. And this is then
and
where, if we go with the mechanic analogy, not only is it, deconstructing something, but what's your purpose of deconstructing it? Why are you taking the car apart? Is it just so you can learn more about the car and create a better understanding of how things work together? Are you doing it because you have an intention of, finding a failed component or rebuilding something? Or is it to make a much larger modification, to make a much larger improvement to the machine? You're not building a whole new car, but the car is going to be new and it's going to be different, even if it more or less looks the same, because you're changing or adding in or improving upon internal components.
But it's especially in like the social sciences, that process will also be, then you will define these different parts according to what you actually want to do. I mean, if you want to solve a problem, then you will define these different parts according to that. Or if you just want to criticize it and get rid of the whole thing, then you will define these parts differently. But now we kind of went off track.
But I think all these things are connected.
Most definitely. But another footnote. Important footnotes. An important discussion.
Too.
But what I find interesting here is that I think I can make a good segue into plagiarism again. When deconstructing something, and you think you're super original, and you make up all these parts, and you define them, and you have a purpose and all that, and suddenly there's something that, or someone has done that before, and you didn't know that. And this kind of, I can connect this to a conversation that I've had with, once again, the PhD veterinary students at Adamstuen. We were talking about plagiarism, and one of them said something like, in the future, there will be so much information on the internet and in the world, and I mean, complexity will just create more complexity. So with that much information around, isn't it impossible not to plagiarize? I mean, as a person, you cannot possibly know all the information in the world. So this is kind of the philosophical discussion around plagiarism.
Mm-hmm. And that's a very fine line, because how do you, again, prove that you are not stealing somebody else's work? And I think realistically what it comes down to is, sure, someone might have said something quite similar, because you're right, we are having, an exponential increase in the volume of research that is being done.
It's never been that much, ever.
No, never, ever. And it's in hundreds of languages as well. There's a lot of material that you will never, ever access if you don't read Russian, if you don't read French, if you don't read Korean
Chinese.
or Japanese, or exactly. Any language that isn't a language that you speak and read. And then, of course, there's issues of access. You might not be able to access these documents without having to pay large amounts of money, and you always need to then judge, is it worth the financial cost for me to access it or not? But I think at least for me, and I'm not an expert on this, so don't take this as the rule, because I'm not 100% on it. But a lot of it really seems to come down more to the context in which you are writing about it. The ideas might be similar, and that's definitely what I'm seeing. These ideas that I'm trying to work with that I think are very valuable for the social sciences have already been very well covered in ecological sciences. But the difference being that there's a gap And I'm trying to exploit that gap by saying there's, the integration that needs to happen needs to be more on the social science side. So, yeah, I'm saying the same thing, but I'm saying it in a slightly different way with a slightly different context than if I were writing in conservation ecology and repeating the same idea. But then again,
and then there will be discoveries,
Yeah.
There will be a lot of research that will lead to discoveries that will open up totally new landscapes, and then
Yes.
you kind of free, I'm free.
And-
you can run
one thing
around in this new world.
Yeah, and one thing we haven't talked about yet is what is sort of general or common knowledge. Because at some point, information does start to fall into the realm of common knowledge. We don't cite, the person who came up with the term climate change.
Definitely not. But
No.
But another thing is that when does something become common knowledge? When does that happen? Because first of all, let's define what common knowledge is.
I would say that common knowledge is things that have become so well accepted that you can almost take it for granted. Now, you can have a more specific example of that. And the example that I typically use when working with students and staff is if you can see the same information, the same idea being presented in a minimum of 3 to 5 sources within the same field, and none of those sources have a citation to it, you can consider it common knowledge within your field. So,
and I mean, and some things you don't need to. I mean, you don't need to check, like that water freezes in sub-zero temperatures.
Exactly.
Kind of, or that the
Folklore,
sun rises in the morning or something.
Yeah, folklore, mythology, religious ideology. I mean, it's always good to go and check your facts, but
also urban legends, I guess.
Yeah.
Because everybody, I mean, you grew up in Canada, I grew up in Norway, and both of us probably heard stories about vicious killers that lived just down the street that were cooking children alive and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Which, I mean, unfortunately happens in the world. That's why these stories even exist. But it wasn't a person like that in my street, at least.
No. And you can't find a source for it necessarily. Now, as you grow older, you might come to realize, well, you can actually cite news stories. So if these are things that are appearing in print or recorded media, then it can become a source if you're going to point to it. But the main idea is, you're right, still probably something that would kind of be seen as an urban legend or common knowledge. So I would say that the best thing to do is, as a rule of thumb, 3 to 5 sources in the same field without a citation to that information, that's probably the point that it has become common knowledge. So
that's a pretty good rule of thumb, I think, because I mean, there will be much more things that eventually will become common knowledge that at this point is, state of the art science, I guess, or like research that has just been done. At some point, that's going to be common knowledge.
And these are all things that it's all part of a shifting and changing research and scientific and academic and educational landscape. These things have always been changing and coming and going. And it does get tough, which is really, we went off on that big footnote 2 tangent on analysis. And this is why I think that analysis is so important. Because as a researcher, as a writer, as a student, you are the person who has to interpret these things yourself. You're the one who ultimately needs to be making these sorts of judgment calls between, is this common knowledge or is this very specific information? Is this common knowledge for my field? Can I get away with a generalization of it in my own words? When is it appropriate to even cite someone? When is it even appropriate to use a direct quote for something? There are a lot of guidelines, but one of the major problems around a lot of this is that it's hard to pin down precise rules. And that's where, if you have no sense of analysis, if you've developed no skill in that, as a student. And if we don't encourage that as educators, that's where I think we're going to keep running into these problems of intentional plagiarism to shortcut the hard work that needs to be done, the unintentional plagiarism of people who don't know because they had never been educated and had never been forced to analyze why we should cite information, and without an analysis of why you're dumping information there in the first place, you're not really going to come up with new, creative, original ideas.
But I think that's like, it's all about accepting that creativity is a major part of analyzing something. So if you can accept that, then you will kind of steer away from, that will be the first stage in steering away from plagiarizing, I think, and also creating much more interesting things and relevant research. But what I also find, we just talked about like common knowledge, and both of us play guitar, and I've experienced this myself. I came up with a riff and I recorded it on my phone a couple of years ago, and then I think it was 6 months ago or something, I got into a new band, right? And suddenly I heard the riff.
Whoa, yeah.
And this band is new. Like this album was I think it's like 10 years old or something, probably more than that. So it's pretty obvious that they came up with that riff before me. But I didn't. I mean, how was I supposed to know? And it's the same thing with a lot of research, right?
Yeah. That kind of stuff has definitely happened before, where people will be like, "Oh, hey, that sounds like this song." It's like, shit. Okay.
And especially
like,
in certain genres, like with the 3-chord punk rock guitar riff. I mean,
country music. Country music is three chords and the truth. That's what they say it is. And I should have had a citation for that.
But also classical music, and know a lot of people will hate me for this, but the thing is that classical music is radically different from a lot of the newer genres, and that's because classical music is very much bound to tradition and not really music as we think about it now, which is a creative outlet. This has had much more of a social kind of like a social purpose. So it was conventions. Something we're supposed to sound a certain way. Like, okay, this flute is supposed to mimic a bird sound, and you're gonna do it like this. Like, I mean, there were a lot of conventions, and they still exist in classical music, and that's why a lot of it just sounds similar, because it's supposed to sound similar.
And there was a lot of plagiarism that happened in a lot of classical music as well. So if you ever sit down and listen and think, oh, this all sounds the same, there is a good chance if it's coming from the same period, people were taking a lot of influence and inspiration, or in some cases, outright plagiarizing other people's work. So this isn't anything.
A whole section, right? And
exactly.
And they usually stole from the what do you call them, the most famous ones, right? Mozart. If you listen to Mozart and compare it to some of these other more obscure composers from the same time, it's like, okay, this guy was crazy. He was definitely something else. His ideas are much more creative, and he's not that bound by convention. But a lot of these other guys just like, okay, that sounded cool. I'm gonna use that part, and I'm just gonna, just like the paper I talked about 50 minutes ago, or maybe not 50, but like 30 minutes ago. The one that was just stitching together all these different quotes. There are classical music which are exactly like that.
Yeah. And another example would be what you could call, I forget the specific term off the top of my head, but sort of simultaneous creation in different places. There's like a very specific term for when that happens, but you can think about the petroleum internal combustion engine was developed separately and almost simultaneously with the diesel engine.
But you could see it with like mythology around the world. Like
And
there are cultures which are on the opposite side of the planet, and they have extremely similar worldview and mythology. Like Norse
Yeah.
mythology and old Vedic, like the old Hinduism, it's very similar. So I mean, it definitely happens.
And that's the thing. We're always influenced by the works that we read. We are influenced by the ideas and the authors who are presenting those things. On the creative front, we're influenced by the musicians and the film stars. And even just think about some of the common phrases that people end up saying, the catchphrases. A lot of people in regular everyday society are, just plagiarizing some catchphrase from something that they saw on television. And in many ways, these sorts of things have become like, more or less have always really been accepted and tolerated. And this is where it gets difficult in the academic environment is, how do you really navigate all of this? Because things like intellectual property rights have become so important and have spilled out of business and particularly out of research and development into other forms of business where now it's possible for record companies to own chords. If you've been following United States legal battles over the last year and a half.
Copyrights.
Yeah. So we're entering this really strange era where we do really quite need to be careful, but I don't think that we need to be scared. I would say,
I think it depends on the context. And another thing, this is obviously much more on the philosophical side again, but I think it's people are similar and they think similar. So we talked about music, we talked about mythology. I mean, if you hear thunder for the first time, and let's say that this is 1,000 years ago, you don't know why the lightning will occur. You will hear the sound, and the easiest way to kind of interpret what is happening is that, it must be like a person that makes that sound, because you will interpret something based on what you know. And the same thing applies to creating music, to creating a riff inside of a specific genre that you like. If you listen to punk rock music, I mean, chances are you're going to make a riff that sounds more or less like a lot of the riffs that bands that you like play. And the same goes for in academia. You're going to come up with ideas and write more or less in the same style as the stuff that you read and are exposed to and like.
And so I guess that's the point, is don't be scared of your own original ideas. Don't be scared of having them and coming up with them. What you should do as a student and as a researcher is support those ideas, demonstrate how other people have helped you form that idea. Give credit where credit is due. And there are really not that many cases that come to mind, none that I can pull up to give you a precise example of, blatant plagiarism in academia. It happens, yes, but it's very often not. It's not something that happens so often that makes so many headlines that you, as a listener, or even Nicholas, like you and I, need to worry about. As long as we're properly citing and referencing, demonstrating that this new thought that we're producing, even if other people might have said it before, is still our own creation based off of the evidence that we have presented that has preceded all of this. This is my analysis based off of it. And I think that that's really the big difference, is a good communicator and a good writer leads you through the information that they're presenting. They're not just dumping it. They're building it in a way that shows your analysis, that leads to your evaluation and your claim about everything that has been produced. And that is very difficult to say.
Like they create a narrative, and I'm not just saying any narrative. They have already decided upon the narrative, but then they make all this information fit. They slip it in where it fits. And that's how they can kind of tell a story and build up to where they are going to discuss some kind of idea or critical aspects of their research. But then they've already set it up in a way so that they've given room for their own creative ideas, and they will support them with information from other people's research.
So in a way, a lot of this is like taking a trip. There are many roads that you could take that all lead to the same destination. The point being with academic research and academic writing would be show the road that you have traveled and how that led you to the destination. Doesn't matter if your destination is the same as someone else's. It's the approach that got you there that makes it unique and makes it original.
And don't be afraid to play with to play with your ideas. Don't be afraid to be a little bit crazy in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Because you could always bounce these ideas with your supervisor, with other students, and if they're too far-fetched, then you can put them in your idea bank. Like we have our both of us play guitar, as I've already said, and we have our riff banks. Like you come up with a riff and you just store it, and you might use it in a song a couple of years. You can do that. You can do the same thing with these ideas, and they will be refined over time.
And for anyone who has actually made it this far, who is still holding out that we're going to talk about specifics of plagiarism, how to avoid it, and where you can find information on proper citing and referencing techniques and formats, I'm going to link in the show description resources from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences Library, who are the resident experts on plagiarism, citations, all things referencing, as well as provide some...
Very good.
They're
very
excellent. We should have had one of them in on this discussing with us as well.
We should, but we could
maybe
do it
for
again.
A future episode.
Yeah.
Also, I'm going to link a few additional resources that we find quite useful at the Writing Center that just provide additional information in different ways. Very often I find that if you can say the same thing in multiple ways, it's more likely that more people are going to be able to understand you. So we'll get some links to the Purdue OWL online writing lab, as well as to some other online sources that we often share with our students as a way to help you out, to keep you from plagiarizing unintentionally, and to hopefully also keep you from information dumping and developing those really good, new, even if they're not wholly unique, research ideas.
So at least everything is unique to a certain point, right? If you put a little bit of flavor in it. But I think to kind of sum this up, be creative, learn how to cite and use references properly, and then it's going to be all right. And this was delivered to you in the style of Chicago, I guess.
Yeah, we'll see about putting those footnotes in there.
All right, man. Thanks for a good conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Until next week.